Today we are joined by Risuna Maluleke from the African Entrepreneurship Development Corporation here at the Gauteng Investment Conference. We're going to be talking about the youth. Is it known that Africa has youth dividends or a youth disaster? Mr. Maluleke, please tell us more.
I don't think we have a youth disaster. I think in actual fact we have a lot of human capital in the form of youth because that's the growing population in our continent, and to that particular point as well, it means that our inability to invest in them will result in actual fact potential loss on human capital in that particular regard. So I think we have gold that needs to be mined and not necessarily disaster in that particular regard.
We've been talking about mining this gold, and I'm asking myself, what is happening in your space around the youth entrepreneurship?
Yeah. So look, man, as you have stated that we have, a growing population in the continent from a youth perspective, which becomes then some sort of, capital, or rather some sort of investment potential in that particular regard. There is also an existence of high levels of unemployment, particularly among the youth aged between 15 and 24, from a South African context, and also by extension from a continental, context and so on. And from that particular perspective, we're saying that for us to be able to harness this potential, there are a lot of opportunities, or rather there are a lot of approaches that can be taken. That is unlocking, capital in the form of corporates to create jobs. But we also believe from our perspective that entrepreneurship is one of the panaceas that actually can resolve to the social ills that particularly is unemployment, creating livelihoods. While that is the case with high levels of unemployment, we also then, unfortunately, in a South African context, have low entrepreneurial activity, while we are saying that entrepreneurship can drive and unlock that economic potential. So what we are doing from our perspective, we are a pioneering entrepreneurship and development finance institution with the main objective of, in actual fact, from entrepreneurial intention to activity, we ought then to unlock potential, from each and every young person who ought to go into entrepreneurship, as well as to establish sustainable enterprises in Africa. That is basically the work that we're doing, and we do this through various skills initiatives. We look at, unlocking investment in the form of giving young entrepreneurs grants, through partnerships, of course. And then we also then look at how do we then actually get to partner with provincial governments, partner with corporations to ensure that we unlock this. And to that effect, we have worked with a lot of, partners from both government as well as, from corporates, big corporates such as Absa Bank. We've worked with the Visas of this world. We've worked with government institutions such as your CIDFAS. The Central Energy Fund remains one of the key players, in the work that we are doing, wholesale and retail sector. So we get to bring together different players, whether they are in skills, whether they are in unlocking, investment, or basically there's just corporates that are driving work for social good. So we get to do all of that. In the central work of what we do is how do we then get from entrepreneurial intent to action? How do we get young people to have their potential unlocked?
Entrepreneurship is very broad, I find, in South Africa, especially amongst the youth.
Yeah.
And the question of young people are always saying that, why do we always get grants from activities and sectors that are far removed from the main economy?
Yes.
Which part can people come to your organization? And maybe you can just unpack it for us, where in the value chain you operate.
Yeah. Look, we have a program, for example, it's called the Zenzele Entrepreneurship, Youth Entrepreneurship Program, right? Whereby its name, actually, we are looking at capacitating young people to take initiative, right? And when you look at getting young people to take initiative, it can look at different dimensions. It becomes a multifaceted kind of initiative and approach to development, where in part of that particular program, we have what we call the Youth Innovation Challenge. So we look at unlocking innovation in one area, but then we also then get to understand that there's actually young people who are driving business in the general business, activities, and then we get to look at that. We unlock this potential, as I've said, that we get to also target the not in employment, education and training group, with a specific focus on those. And then there's also an element of us then focusing on unlocking potential for those that are in the township and the rural communities. We get to travel across South Africa with what we call the Youth Entrepreneurship Tour. This Youth Entrepreneurship Tour then allows us to engage with different groups of entrepreneurs, young people who are looking to go into entrepreneurship. So to your question of, in actual fact, which sectors, are we looking at? We look at broad sectors, and as I've said, for example, we had a partnership with Visa and ABSA where we were actually doing grant funding, focusing on young people who are in the innovation
Grant,
space.
how much are we talking about? 50,000,
We're
500,000?
talking about 100,000 per SME.
Okay.
So in fact, we're looking at entrepreneurs who are starting out. So it's 100,000 towards an SME. And this 100,000 was actually allocated towards two broad things. One, we were looking at the issue of a grant that is focusing on giving a stipend to the entrepreneur. And then part of the grant was looking at actually product development. And you will be surprised that in actual fact, as part of that particular program, the young entrepreneurs then started unlocking more funding. Because what we are saying is that the gap that exists between development finance institutions as well as commercial finance institutions is that on one hand of the development finance, there's too much bureaucracy. Then if the opportunity presents itself today, by the time they respond to you, the opportunity has long gone. And on the other side, there's a lot of requirements from regulatory perspective, because it is in actual fact guided and defined by the Financial Services Conduct Authority and so on. Then now, young people may not have some of those requirements. We are saying, how do we get a young person to meet the requirements of the commercial finance institutions, but while they are also awaiting an opportunity to be funded by development finance, how do we get to keep them in business and so on? So those are some of the things that we're looking at in terms of supporting. So we get grant funding, and then we also then look at skilling these people, preparing them to be able to take up some of these grants, investment readiness and so on. So we have all of these things within the context of our work to ensure that it is not just only from just a skilling perspective, or now saying to young people, we are only going to focus on innovation, because we also get to meet a young person who in the Northern Cape, for example, all she is doing, she's selling water. I mean, for example, I'll give you this example as I gave it back to you. We went to the Northern Cape last year. There was one young person, and in this particular community, she's selling water, she purifies water and so on. And she stopped functioning in a business because the equipment was broken. And guess how much she was looking for? She was just looking for 3,500.
Sure.
And 3,500 takes away a livelihood of a young person. And upon our engagement with this young person, we're able to give that grant towards fixing. She's back in operations. A livelihood is, preserved, and then families, are being fed and so on. And this is not just like the only story. We have a lot of those stories. We can go to the Northwest, working with the provincial government there, establishing an entrepreneurship and innovation hub, through the Department of Economic Development that is led by MEC Bitsaling Kopan. So we are working with different partners, and this year we'll be launching 2 hubs in KZN. We'll be launching another one in the Eastern Cape, driving all of these efforts together with government, together with private sector. The Central Energy Fund is coming on board to support in that particular end, and ABSA is funding for us to skill about 1,000 young people across the country. So these are some of the initiatives that we're looking at in driving, impact and.
Sounds like music to my ears.
Yeah.
Gauteng Maluleke, thank you for joining us on BRICS Africa channel.
Thank you so much for having me, and have a beautiful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.